Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden konuklar ağırlayarak farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyor. Dünyayı Ekotürk ekranında buluşturuyoruz. Bu hafta biraz Çin'in Orta Doğu'da giderek artan rolünü ve etkisini konuşacağız. Ocak ayı ortalarında Çin, Orta Doğu'da özellikle atağa geçti. Körfez ülkeleri, İran ve Türkiye'den birbiri ardına üst düzey ziyaretlere ev sahipliği yaptı. İran'la geçen yıl imzalanan 25 yıllık stratejik anlaşmanın resmen yürürlüğe girmesi, Körfez ülkeleriyle bir serbest ticaret anlaşmasının imzalanması yakın gelecekte, Suriye'nin resmen Çin'in kuşak yol projesine dahil edilmesi gibi bölge için son derece kritik konular masada. ABD'nin bölgedeki etkisini azaltmasıyla birlikte Çin'in bu boşluğu doldurup doldurmayacağı tartışılıyor. Her ne kadar Çin Dışişleri Bakanı ABD'nin Orta Doğu'da bıraktığı güç boşluğunu doldurmayacağız dese de tartışmalar epeydir bu yönde devam ediyor. Bu hafta biraz bu konuları ele almak istiyoruz alanında uzman bir isimle. Çin ve Orta Doğu ilişkileri denince akla gelen ilk isimlerden biri. Bu alanda kitapları da bulunan Abu Dhabi'deki Zayed Üniversitesi'nden siyaset bilimci Dr. Jonathan Fulton bizlerle. Welcome, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Feyza.
Thank you. Well, Professor, there are lots of issues to talk, and we have a limited time, so let's start. China-Middle East relations have been growing rapidly. Just recently, the foreign ministers of 6 regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran, as well as the Secretary General of the GCC, traveled to China. Beijing is increasingly becoming an important economic and political actor in the region. Is it part of China's broader global rise in recent years? And how does Belt and Road initiative play a role here in shaping China's Middle East strategy?
Well, Feyza, I'm glad you mentioned the Belton Road, because often when people talk about China and the Middle East, they tend to focus on economic interests, and with that, they often limit it to energy trade. And of course, energy is a major concern or a major interest of China in the Middle East. But in recent years, especially since 2013, the Belton Road initiative has become increasingly a big part of what China is doing in the region. I think when we think about what the Belton Road is, it's an important economic initiative for Beijing to connect markets and countries across multiple regions. And the Mediterranean, of course, is one of the major endpoints for Beijing, because the EU is China's biggest trading partner, and you can't get to the EU either over land or by sea unless you're passing through the Middle East. So since 2013, you've seen China playing a much bigger political role. It's not just mainly an economic role anymore, but it's playing a larger political role as well, and that definitely explains a lot of what China's been doing here.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor, you also mentioned that, but I want to ask you to talk about in more details, because China heavily relies on the region for energy. But as you also mentioned, I mean, it's importing over 40% of its oil from the Middle East. But as you also mentioned, the nature of China's presence in the region is not only limited to energy. It's much more complex and beyond energy. So I want to ask you, what are the other motivations, both for China and the Middle East countries, to grow stronger ties?
Okay, well, first from China's side, primarily China's interests here remain economic, because, again, the Belton Road is described by Chinese leaders as a geo-economic initiative rather than a political one. Now, whether or not we believe that's true, China is largely an economic actor in the Middle East. Now, in terms of what it's doing here beyond energy, because, like you said, energy is very, very important, but at the same time, these companies have been doing a tremendous amount of contracting. You've seen in the past few years, many Middle Eastern countries have rolled out these vision projects: Saudi Vision 2030, Abu Dhabi Vision 2030, New Kuwait 2035. All of these projects are about economic diversification and developing new industries and new sectors to build a stronger, more resilient, and more diversified local economy. So China, of course, its companies have been doing a lot of infrastructure construction, a lot of digital construction, a lot of renewable energy projects. So China's companies have been doing a lot of business here. So it's not just about the energy. Of course, there are political considerations, because it plays such a big role here. It requires the region to be somewhat stable. So China's been politically working with a lot of the status quo countries in the region. So, it's got political goals, it's got economic goals, and increasingly it's got security goals as well, because it has to play a larger role in order to ensure that its interests are being protected. Now, you also asked about the region's interest in engaging with China, and of course, we all are watching what's happening at the international level. The U.S. has shifted from a counterterrorism foreign policy to strategic competition. At the center of a lot of what it's doing internationally, it's identified Russia and China as its main strategic competitors. So that requires the U.S. especially to be more active in the Indo-Pacific region. That means that Gulf actors, especially, or Middle Eastern countries, are looking at a U.S. presence that may not be as deeply anchored in the Middle East as it has been since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. So they're looking also to diversify which countries they engage with. And China, with its Belton Road and with its tremendous trade and economic presence, it makes sense to do deeper business with China as well. Not just China, but primarily China seems to be a major hedge for regional countries.
We will talk about the US-China competition and its implications in the region also, Professor. But since you mentioned security aspect, I want to also ask, because as you know, currently China's one and only overseas military base is in Djibouti, Africa. So you think China's engagement in the region will remain mainly on economy and development, or it will also increase its military presence by the time?
Well, it can't remain limited to the economic. I think largely, you said we'd return to the U.S.-China relationship later, but I think it's at the center of everything. Now, China has had a modest security presence, largely because most of the benefits or most of its interests in the region have been secured under the U.S. security commitments to the region. So China hasn't needed to play a bigger role. Now, since the Trump administration initiated the trade war and limited or targeted China as a strategic competitor, we've seen the logic in Beijing start to shift, where Chinese leaders are starting to think they need to play a more muscular role in regional affairs, and that's certainly been the case in recent years. You see, just yesterday, the Chinese defense minister spoke with the Saudi defense minister and talked about engaging more seriously on defense matters. That's, I think, inevitable for China's interests. They're going to have to play a bigger role. They can't rely on the U.S. military to guarantee their interests in the region. So I expect that we will see a bigger Chinese security presence.
I see. As a maybe follow-up question also, Professor, there is this, as you also mentioned, U.S. Part of the story. So this narrative of weakening U.S. presence and potential so-called power vacuum in the region. And recent withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, further raised concerns among the regional countries. But on the other hand, Chinese officials say the country will not fill the so-called power vacuum after U.S. pullout. So what is your take? Do you think China is willing to replace the U.S. role in the region? And does it have a real interest? And if yes, does it have enough capacity for this?
Well, absolutely not. China has no interest in playing the same type of security role that the U.S. has played here over the past 30 years. It's just not in China's interests. It's not how it does regional affairs. I also think that the idea of the U.S. leaving the region is deeply exaggerated. I think U.S. interests in the Middle East have been changing fundamentally over the past decade or 2 decades. And as a result, I think we're seeing a U.S. policy start to also change. But when you look around the Gulf, for example, there are still more than 35,000 U.S. troops in the region. There's a deep U.S. Military presence. The idea that the U.S. is leaving is really an exaggeration. So I don't think the idea that the U.S. is leaving should drive regional politics. I do think leaders in the Gulf or in the Middle East are worried about American commitments. I think Afghanistan changed the way people think about U.S. commitments, but I think it's a mischaracterization to say that there's a power vacuum like the foreign minister of China said last week. I think what there is just a recalibration of what the U.S. is doing in the region. It certainly creates opportunities for China and other competitors or other major powers to play a bigger role. I do expect to see a diversification process of different extra-regional security providers, but I don't think it's a matter of the U.S. leaves and China comes. China has no interest in pursuing that, and it doesn't have the capacity either at this point, to be honest.
I see. Enver Gargash, Emirati diplomatic advisor and former minister, once said, what we are worried about is this fine line between acute competition and a new Cold War. So I want to follow with this question. How does the US-China competition shape the Middle East-China relations in general? And what are the risks and challenges for regional countries in the near future? You think they will have to pick a side, or what kind of challenges they will face in the near future?
Well, in the short term, it seems to be nothing but challenges. And I hope that that logic doesn't come to dominate, because really, you're right. When you look at the region, you see that China is the primary economic partner for most countries, especially in the Gulf. You know, whether that's in trade or investment or contracting or whatever, China is a major economic power actor for a lot of countries in the region. And of course, the US is a major diplomatic and security partner for a lot of countries in the region. So this competition, this strategic competition narrative that's coming out of Beijing and Washington, really does put a lot of other countries, not just here, but in multiple regions around the world, it puts a lot of countries in this very difficult situation where they have to either choose sides or they have to articulate a reason and a policy to explain why they're not choosing sides and get Washington and Beijing to accept this. So it's a very, very complicated situation right now. I don't think anybody anywhere likes this idea that they have to pick, because frankly, despite talk of decoupling or any other number of strategies to limit Chinese influence in the US economy or American influence in the Chinese economy, we've lived in this globalized environment for more than 30 years, and every country's economy has already been deeply intertwined with others, and it's going to be tremendously difficult. It's not like the Cold War between the Soviets and the US, when there was almost no economic engagement between these two poles. Right now, the US and China remain each other's biggest trading and investment partners, and every country that does business with each of them has a lot of direct links with both. So Minister Gargash, I think, has made this point quite eloquently and quite frequently. It puts the UAE and other regional actors in a pretty uncomfortable position if the choice is pick sides. Hopefully, cooler heads prevail, and this isn't going to drive the way that other countries have to engage with the superpowers, because frankly, nobody wants this.
What about Washington, Professor? Nobody wants this, but how is the reaction, or how is Washington's approach to this matter? Because they are, the US presence is declining, as we have seen from Afghanistan's case, but at the same time, it's also against China's rise in the region, in global area. So how is the US approach to this matter, China's rise and China's increasing role in the region? Washington expects, you think, the regional countries to pick a side, to be honest?
Well, I think what's happened is that China's role in the region has been pretty deep and broad for, I would say, 15 or 20 years. China's increasingly become a major regional presence. Now, it became an issue, I would say, in 2019 is when it became a more politicized issue in Washington. The 5G Huawei issues seemed to resonate in the US, and it became a much bigger issue than it was previously. Now, I think you're right. The US has made it pretty clear that on certain sectors that they deem sensitive, they want Middle East allies or partners to not engage with China.
Yeah.
Whether that's in security or tech or things like this. It's a hard case to make, because although this has been an issue since 2019, a lot of these countries have been engaging with China on these tech issues well before that. They have the infrastructure in place, they have the physical hardware in place, and they've got systems that they've been developing for 5-10 years in support of this. And again, when you see a lot of their diversification projects, they want things like digital economies, fintech, 5G, AI, stuff that China does quite well, and China's been doing with them. So it's going to be tough. I mean, yes, Washington has to make a case, and frankly, until now, it hasn't really convinced too many folks that they have to make a choice on this. there isn't really an obvious alternative that's being offered to say America does this instead of Chinese 5G. It's go with Ericsson, for example. I think the U.S. has to do a better job of articulating why they think it's important, because frankly, most countries in the region don't see the issue in the same way Washington does. Of course, America has its interests, and these countries all have their interests as well, and they don't necessarily come together on this issue. So it's a pretty complicated issue to navigate.
Mm-hmm. So you think, especially Gulf countries and Middle East countries in general, will keep this balance, hard balance, while trying to keep their relations, good relations with the U.S. and developing good relations also at the same time with China. So it seems like a tough balance at this point, right?
It is a tough balance, but I'm speaking to you, as you said, from Abu Dhabi, and this week, of course, there was an attack on Abu Dhabi that was repelled by U.S. Missile defense systems. Mm-hmm. China doesn't offer anything like this, so this, I think, if anything, really demonstrated the need for continued. This demonstrated the utility of the U.S. presence, and the fact that the U.S. is here in a pretty deep and meaningful way isn't lost on anybody. Now, again, China doesn't offer this type of partnership yet. China has a very long-standing non-security or non-alliance policy. It doesn't do military security in the same way that the U.S. does. So I think a lot of countries are going to look to China and think, well, if you can't, in a very competitive region, in a region where security is an immediate concern for many countries, if you can't offer the same type of thing, there is a limit on the relationship. And I think that's why it puts them in such a difficult situation, because it's not a matter of saying, well, China offers the full range of options that the U.S. no longer does. There are certain things they get from each country, and I think that's why they would like to try to maintain this difficult balance. But again, this is a very hard thing to pull off in the current environment.
Mm-hmm. Professor, I want to ask Iran specifically, because China, in general, China is trying to keep a neutral position in regional affairs, it seems. But Iran is I think, challenging task because, it is one of the major threats for the Gulf countries. And China recently signed a 25-year cooperation agreement, and it's clearly against the U.S. sanctions on Tehran. So how long can China keep this neutral position in the region, do you think? And can China balance ties with Iran and GCC at the same time?
Well, the first thing I'd say is I disagree with the characterization of China's position as neutrality, because while China does have this partnership agreement with Iran, it has the same partnership agreement with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE. And the difference is that when the Iranian foreign minister went to China last week, they said, we're now entering the implementation stage of this 25-year partnership. The partnership was signed in 2016.
Yeah.
So if they finally came to terms last spring after 5 years, and then 1 year later they're starting to operationalize it, you can see already the limitations. Now, if you compare that with the Saudi Comprehensive Strategic Partnership that was signed the same week as the Iranian one, just a few days before, it was operationalized and implemented immediately. And since then, they've seen tens of billions of dollars in deals signed and a lot of very important projects for both countries implemented. The same thing, the UAE partnership was signed in 2018. It was immediately implemented. They're cooperating on things like Sinopharm or on COVID vaccine. They're cooperating on a lot of really important political and economic initiatives. This was implemented and operationalized immediately. The Iranian one, it's taken 6 years to get to that stage. So I don't think that China sees Iran the same way it sees the Arabian side of the Gulf. I think that it has much deeper economic and strategic and political value on this side, but they just don't see the need to antagonize Iran. Now, I think China sees Iran as an important partner. When you say China is against sanctions, U.S. sanctions on Iran, that's true, but China's against U.S. sanctions in general. It's something that the U.S. uses increasingly as a tool of statecraft, and China just doesn't like this. So when China's supporting Iran, it seems to me what it's doing is saying, okay, we'll sign this comprehensive strategic partnership. And anything like 25 years or $400 billion or bases. A lot of this stuff hasn't been confirmed by either country. It seems to me to be a lot of speculation. But they did say this is a partnership to cooperate on issues of mutual concern. So China says we'll develop this partnership with you, and perhaps it will become a bigger issue. They also said a few months after that they were open to Iran joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a full member. Both of these things, I think, could be very, very useful to Iran, but only if Iran is no longer under sanctions. And the only way Iran is not under sanctions is if it joins the JCPOA again. You know, if it joins again, if the U.S. and Iran are able to resolve this problem. Of course, it doesn't just come from the Iranian side; it also comes from Washington. But without Iran joining the JCPOA and renegotiating this and coming to an agreement with the U.S., sanctions will continue, and the partnership is useless in this case because no Chinese company is going to go and do business or invest in Iran if they know they're going to be sanctioned by the U.S., its biggest economic partner. Mm-hmm. The same thing with the SCO membership. If Iran becomes a full member but it's under sanctions, then the membership is useless. So I think what China's doing is they're telling Iran, if you start to behave like a responsible country, stop being a revisionist power that's trying to upend regional order, you have a path towards tremendous economic benefits coming from us. But if you don't, it will be much like, you know, the partnership agreement that was signed just months after the JCPOA. China said, you join the JCPOA, we give you this partnership. But as soon as Trump was elected and said, I'm going to leave the JCPOA, China basically stopped working actively towards the partnership and minimized its involvement with Iran. So to me, this shows us that China's interests ultimately lie towards better relations with the U.S. And what it's doing with Iran right now actually seems to line up pretty neatly with America's preferences in getting Iran back to the table. So in this case, I think what China's doing is developing Iran's value as a bargaining chip in China's relationship with Washington.
My last question will be about Turkey, Professor, as a Middle Eastern, regional, as a regional power, let's say. Turkey is also developing good relations with China, but different than other Middle East countries, Turkey is also a member of NATO, which sees China as a threat. Also, there is this highly sensitive Uyghurs issue. While it doesn't really seem to be a major concern for Muslim countries, it is still a potential setback for bilateral relations, I guess. So where does Turkey stand in China's regional strategy? And this particular issue I mentioned has a negative impact in your view?
I think that issue is important, but I don't think it's the only one. I think that Turkey, when you look at the size of Turkey's economy and its geostrategic or geopolitical value, then you would expect to see very deep China-Turkey relations. But I think that hasn't been the case, and I think that's because there are political limitations that prevent this relationship from deepening the way you would expect. For one thing, I mentioned earlier about the Belton Road initiative. The Belton Road is about connecting markets and countries, as I said earlier. And to really take advantage of this, a country needs to be, deeply linked with other countries within its own region. So you can connect to different supply chains and you can connect to different markets in an easy way. Turkey, of course, has had in recent years quite challenging relations with a lot of its neighbors in the Middle East and, in Europe as well. And this, I think, limits the connectivity value of Turkey. When you think of Turkey's problems with the Emirates or with Saudi, with Greece, you see that it geopolitically should connect very deeply with all these places, but politically it doesn't. And as a result, I think you've seen less and less Chinese engagement. And the Uyghur issue, as you mentioned, is another issue. Of course, Turkey feels that this is a very important issue, as the Uyghurs are ethnically a Turkic people. So, of course, Turkish leaders have to be vocal on this issue, but this is something that for China is a major domestic political concern, and to be criticized on it by a foreign country is really something that China won't accept. So I think there are a lot of political issues that stand in the way of a deeper China-Turkey relationship, despite what would look on the face of it like nothing but advantages for deeper cooperation.
I see. Well, unfortunately, time is up, Professor. Thank you very much. And by the way, congratulations on your new book, Routledge Handbook of on China-Middle East Relations. I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thanks. One of your colleagues, Altayatli, has a chapter which is fantastic, looking at Turkey. So thank you. Thank you for mentioning it.
Thank you very much, Professor. And say hi to Abu Dhabi, please.
Absolutely. Hi to everybody in Turkey as well.
Thank you very much. Evet, Saat Farkı'nı böylelikle bu haftada noktalamış olduk. Abu Dhabi'deki Zayed Üniversitesi'nden siyaset bilimci Jonathan Fulton'la konuştuk. Çin'in Orta Doğu'daki etkinliğini, artan nüfuzunu, etkisini konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.